Everyone, my name is Donna Patson. I am one of the toxicologists at NMS Laboratories, and I am sharing with you my presentation that I just presented at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences that was held in February of 2022. I wanted to record the presentation, and so I won't be held to the standards, the time standards, the time limitations that I had for that meeting. So please bear with me, but it's going to be longer than I think the 15 minutes of what I had to abide by for the Seattle meeting. So this presentation is dedicated to the 2021 NPS landscape, basically what we reported in 2021 of that drug category. I'm going to talk about the nuance, and the long haulers. So just trying to look at NPS positivity with the appropriate context. Of course, to give a disclaimer that I'm an employee of NMS Laboratories, which is a commercial provider of toxicology. Of course, all of our, we're going to talk about testing that was performed at NMS and what we reported. So this slide, if you may have seen this from other presentations that I have given, but this slide just talks about the different definitions of NPS. And these definitions were really we started to define them back when NPS started to come about, which is at the late 2000s, early 2010s. And basically the NPS can be from a number of different things. What we are familiar with is that when you take a drug and you chemically modify it very, very small amounts, like alprazolam to fluoprazolam, fluoprazolam is considered an NPS because it has that small chemical change. Or it could be something that was discovered for and researched for pharmaceutical applications, such as all these different fentanyl analogs, any other opioid agonists. They were researched, but then failed pharmaceutical, failed those clinical trials or didn't progress to clinical trials, and then they're now observed in the street drug supply. There's also substances that are used in a novel way or different manner from their original intended use, and that includes something like Mitragynine. Anyway, so these are a lot of the different definitions that we are familiar with for NPS. But if you think about the time frames now, we're talking about mid-2000s, which we can all agree was quite a bit, a number of years ago at this point. And just to go over the 2020 European Drug Report, again, you might have seen this in other presentations that I have given, but this slide just goes to show you all the number and categories of NPS that have been reported to the early drug warning system between 2008 and 2019. But you can just see there's a ton of different substances, a ton of different categories. It peaked in 2014, but we're still seeing a lot of these are new reports for each year. So from a toxicology laboratory standpoint, it's obviously very difficult, right? You can't generate testing for a new substance every time one hits the market, because there's all these kinds of factors that you have to look into it. Is it a substance that has activity? Is it something that the drug users are going to use? Is it something that's going, what's the public health risk to it, public safety risk? All these kinds of things that have to go into that assessment. So what we know with the NPS phenomena, it's typically, again, these drugs are typically new, typically transient, meaning they have short lifespans, but we have very limited information. We have limited information about clinical trials, limited information regarding positivity. Their prevalence is underestimated because you need the specialized testing usually. You can't find something if you're not looking for it. So unless your testing is covering a particular substance, it's really impossible to determine positivity. These are subject to national, international influences, so not just like scheduling actions, like domestic scheduling actions. There's also international scheduling actions or even export bans. We've seen drop off of positivity just from more of export ban from places like China, who are the one who are countries that supply a lot of these substances for use. And I like this graphic on the right a lot because, again, it shows you that there's always things going in, there's always things going out, but there's these substances that that are on the market, and just trying to figure out what substances that are on the market is always difficult. You never know how long something is going to stay on that market. So it's just this market for NPS is a constant state of flux. So now we're going to change gears, obviously with the background of NPS. Now we're going to talk about NPS that we have reported, NMS Labs has reported in 2021, and we're breaking it down by category. So this is the synthetic stimulant and hallucinogen category of NPS. So what we have reported, we've reported 235 findings in 231 different bloods, not like the largest category that we have. Of those 235 cases, the majority have been Utilones. That's that blue. So it's basically the most positive or most popular synthetic stimulant in 2021 was this Utilone drug. We have Pentalone in this light blue at 4%, and then you have also some, as always happens with NPS, you have ones and twos of these, a bunch of other drugs, including alpha PHP, which we don't differentiate from its isomer alpha PIHP, 3-hydroxy-PCP, 3-methoxy-PCP, fluorphenmetrazine, some ketamine analogs we're starting to see, and a ton of cyclidine as well. So they comprise the remaining 5% of these detections in synthetic stimulants. But so it's interesting in this category, though, however, is that Utilone, so Utilone we've seen for a while now, and I have this graph here because it shows you this this stimulant of the stimulant evolution between 2012 and 2021, particularly the cathinones. So you see over in 2012, methylone was the big one at that time in that yellow, and then it progressed as ethylone, which was a little bit of period of time, and then we had a little bit of butylone in green, but really like the big players were always this methylone, which progressed eventually to N-ethylpentalone, which progressed to Utilone. And really, when we had a very popular stimulant, it lasted about like 1 to 2 years, pretty good. And Utilone is now reaching the end of that positivity. So we're paying attention. If you see that bright yellow at the end, that is Pentalone. So this is a little interesting because Pentalone is a substance, is a stimulant that we actually saw by itself a couple years. You can see a little bit at the top of 2017, 2018. So we used to see it by itself. But now we're in late 2021, Q3 and Q4, we're starting to see it pop up. And so the question is why? We think we know why. We think Pentalone, well, actually we know why, is that Pentalone is now being seen as a metabolite of N-N-dimethylpentalone. So N-N-dimethylpentalone is this new stimulant that is emerging that we are only seeing as the metabolite currently. Pentalone is present because of the breakdown of N-N-dimethylpentalone. We think this N-N-dimethylpentalone will replace Utilone as the next big stimulant. So we, as a laboratory, now have to transition or working on developing toxicology testing to cover this new stimulant. So again, for anyone who works in the laboratory and starting to see Pentalone cases, the real reason is this N-N-dimethylpentalone. So again, all the things that we track, they track the changes over time and the positivity for different analytes. So now moving on to the synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonist in 2021. So this is a smaller category. We have 144 findings and 119 different blood samples. I did group together the metabolites, so we're not double counting that positivity. The majority of our samples or positive cases were MDMB-14 Panaca, 53%. However, that was really only after our update for synthetic cannabinoid testing. So that's always something that you have to keep in the back of your mind, is that the scope of this test was updated in June 2021 and would include the MDMB-14 Panaca. So it's always very difficult because as soon as we generate one scope for NPS and get it live, because that obviously takes quite a bit of time, something new comes out, making that scope less than ideal, I should say. Other positive findings, 5-fluor-MDMB-Pica, 4-fluor-MDMB Panaca metabolite. But something that the drug that we are keeping an eye on is this like intersection red, is that ADB Butanaca. So ADB Butanaca is not in our routine synthetic cannabinoid scope and only available per special request, but we do know that we are seeing it and we're reporting it from our special investigation. But because it's not in our routine synthetic cannabinoid scope, we know that positivity is underestimated. So that's the new synthetic cannabinoid that we are monitoring and will hopefully be in the next update, hopefully in a timely manner. The next category, designer benzodiazepines in 2021. So we have seen a huge increase in designer benzodiazepine positivity and prevalence. Both we're seeing larger number of cases and a larger range of substances, making this category one of the more popular groups. So there's been 3,200 designer benzodiazepine findings in almost over 1,900 different blood samples. But we do have 3 metabolite pairs that we look for. I'm sure the one people are most familiar with is that we see a lot of atizolam, and we look for its metabolite alpha hydroxyatizolam. We also see a lot of fluoprazolam at 16%. We're seeing more and more flubromazolam. There's the bromazolam, and 8-aminoclinazolam, which is the clinazolam metabolite. Are not part of the routine designer benzo method that we have and require special testing and the special investigation process. So we know positivity for bromazolam and the 8-aminoclinazolam are certainly underestimated. The other thing that we have to that is kind of a fly in the ointment here is that clinazolam is in the routine benzo method. Or designer benzo method, excuse me. But we know it's either it breaks down fast to the 8-aminoclinazolam or there's limited stability. So we actually see a lot of 8-aminoclinazolam without the presence of clinazolam. So if we had this addition of 8-aminoclinazolam into the routine designer benzo method, we'd actually have this increased positivity for this clinazolam and metabolite. So it's just something to keep in mind that you can't just look at parent drugs. You sometimes require the use of the inclusion of the metabolite to really get proper positivity. There's also a lot of other benzodiazepines. There's obviously you can see all the different ones on the right. Some have low positivity, obviously, compared to the bigger players. But it's just a lot of different substances that we're continuing to see, and we see designer benzos in a lot of cases. So I want to draw attention to the bromazepam here, because that's another drug that we see about in the 2% of the designer benzo cases. So this slide is to kind of show you that context matters. So bromazepam is actually a benzodiazepine that is prescribed in Canada. And when we look at our casework, when we're looking at the cases that are positive for bromazepam, 44% of the bloods are reported from Canada. So when it's a Canadian case, it likely is not a designer benzodiazepine use. I mean, that's assuming that someone is prescribed that in Canada. But that would mean that really for the bromazepam to fall under the designer benzodiazepine category, you really would need to remove the context of originating place. As like, if it's from Canada, it likely is illicit. When its use is in the U.S., it's likely illicit. And that's likely, obviously, you're making a lot of assumptions. Another drug that we are careful of is the tianeptine. So this is another drug that is confirmed by special investigation. This is an atypical antidepressant with mu opioid activity, and it's prescribed in several European countries, but we're seeing it a lot being used as a supplement. So on the bottom there, you can see that there's the prescription package for actual tianeptine tablets, but then this supplement on the right is really for this recreational use as a memory enhancer. So we know what the plasma concentration should be for doses related to the therapeutic doses. So you see at 350 to 400 nanograms per milliliter. But when we look at our cases, 76% of them had blood concentrations greater than 1,000 nanograms per milliliter. So that really gives the context that what we're seeing is that super therapeutic use, or not even, not therapeutic, but more of that non-controlled use that we can see with supplements. Again, the context matters for determining something is an NPS use or not. And going into the category of novel synthetic opioids in 2021, so this is a very large category that we see a lot of reports for, almost 3,000 detections of novel synthetic opioids and almost 3,000 different bloods. I'm sure it comes from shock from no one in the laboratory that parafluorofentanyl has dominated this category for the past year. So if you took out parafluorofentanyl, other fentanyl analogs accounted for almost 9% of the detections, or a little over 9% of the detections. You're talking about carfentanil, a little butyrylfentanyl, some of the other fentanyl analogs. We're still seeing carfentanil quite a bit in British Columbia. They still see it in their illicit drug supply. So if you remove, though, parafluorofentanyl and a little scattering of the other fentanyl analogs, non-fentanyl related novel synthetic opioids comprise about 6.7%, and the nitazene category accounted for the majority of those. So that was the isotonitazene, the metonitazene, the N-pyridinoetonitazene, and all of those cases that have been reported in 2021. So that category, you took up parafluorofentanyl, would be pretty significant of the novel synthetic opioids, but everything's so dominated by parafluorofentanyl right now that it's tough to see that comparison. And again, even parafluorofentanyl is, small in comparison to fentanyl in general. And just the pictures on the right kind of show illicit narcotic formulations that contained parafluorofentanyl. And those were from, these were seized in Philadelphia. I just wanted to, I'm sure this graph may have been, has been in other presentations of mine, so it may not be new for some others, but again, showing waves of detections, and then the influence from different measures, controlling measures. So in gray, you have isotonitazene detections by TOF. So that started in like April 2019 and then continued. In June of 2020, there was a notice of intent filed to schedule isotonitazene by the DEA. And then you can see the emergence in blue of that Brorphine. So basically you had isotonitazene rising in popularity. The DEA took notice because of the work that this laboratory did in conjunction with the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. Then there was the emergence of Brorphine in response to that. So that's the blue, and then that started to rise. There was a notice of intent to schedule that in December 2020, and you can see in red the popped up of metonitazene. This data is only through June 2021. We've seen metonitazene continue to be popular or to be positive throughout 2021. So another way to look at positivity data is geographical. And again, this may not be the first time people have seen these slides, but this is positive postmortem bloods for isotonitazene compared to metonitazene. And you can see here that a lot of the positive cases that we've had have come from like the Midwest area. Isotonitazene has also seen some cases down in the South. But again, our data is going to be limited because we obviously don't do consistent testing throughout the country. We're only going to report something that when people are looking for it. So we're not going to find them in basic cases. We shouldn't find them in expanded cases. But as a nanoscope finding, it's also subject to whether a client approves that additional testing. And they might have sufficient results if they already have like a sky-high fentanyl. They might be happy with what they already have and don't need that extra of the extra interpretation that an NPS would give. However, it obviously gives really good pharmacoepidemiological information to try and track the spread of these NPS. So just kind of rounding it out with Mitragynine. So Mitragynine is technically considered an NPS. However, it has now been around for a long time. We've been out reporting it for, 10 years at least. You can see some of the supplements, the pictures of the supplements here. We are now at an average of 154 cases a month. Like you saw with other, and this is for 2021 data. We've been, again, reporting it for quite a bit of time at this point. So we've had almost 2,000 cases just from Mitragynine this year in 2021. Now, for other cases I showed you, you have this, like for a lot of NPS, you have this ebb and flow, right? You have this peak and then a drop off when something happens. So Mitragynine looks very stable at this point. We're just seeing a lot of it. We continue to see a lot of it, and it's just part of the drug scene. So then the question starts to become, when do we really call it an NPS, or when do we stop calling it an NPS? So I wanted to bring this back to terms that we're all now unfortunately very familiar with. If you're thinking about it in the COVID sense, we have this epidemic versus endemic. And so I wanted to give these terms, like outbreak is a sudden occurrence. We've seen situations like this when you have these anticoagulants, contaminated synthetic cannabinoids, that kind of thing. And when we talk about epidemic, you're talking about affecting many persons at the same time, occurring at a level of region or community. Pandemic is spread more across the entire country or landmass, but is massive in both reach and impact, right? Like COVID pandemic affected every aspect of our lives. But then when we start getting to endemic, this is prevalent or restricted to a particular location, region, or population. Or we're talking like how now COVID is just endemic, and how is that different now compared to when it was considered obviously a pandemic. So in summary, we have reported more than 40 different NPS from various subclasses in 2021. By class, the designer benzos and the novel synthetic opioids are detected in the largest number of cases with a variety of analytes. So going back to that NPS, the popularity and proliferation of them are influenced by a large number of factors, including these different lifespans, legislative actions, market supply, geographical trends. But this is the point of this whole presentation, is that we have to start thinking about NPS in a different way, in that it's now, these substances are now, some of them are not old or not new. Some of them, like Atizilum and Mitragynine, have been around for over a decade. So when do we transition an NPS from emergent to routine? Like, for example, or endemic. Like, for example, Atizilum we've been seeing for so long is now not really designer benzodiazepine, but really should be included in the routine benzo method because we're just seeing it that frequently. And so when we're talking about, these are now like having to rethink like our scopes of testing and whether or not we are appropriately categorizing some of these currently termed NPS. The other question is also if a proliferation of an NPS appears to be rooted in changes to drug supply. This is really talking about parafluorofentanyl. Should we characterize parafluorofentanyl as an NPS? NPS is so massive in reach at this point because it's tied to the in most cases it's tied to the fentanyl. That's of epidemic and pandemic proportions. And again, do we need to change our scope of testing to reflect that reality of parafluorofentanyl and its scope of reach? So again, it's trying to say, like, for some NPS may only be around for 6 months or a year. So okay, you consider this like really new. But when you have drugs that are in 10, 12 years, I don't really we can't really call this baby you can't call your 12-year-old a toddler, a baby anymore. It's not so much a baby. So those are the kinds of questions that I think we have to start asking, because NPS has now, as a category, has been around for quite a bit of time. And so we have to start considering, are there time components and impact components to how we define them? So maybe changing those definitions a little bit. So I spent way over time what I originally had done for AFS. So I thank you all for listening to this. I hope you got some new information from it. Again, I try to thank the people who are able to help make this all work. Again, without the laboratory staff doing what you do every single day, we wouldn't be able to report on this. It's really, again, I can't thank you all enough for what you do. If anyone has any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.